the recording. There we go. And what she's singing about in the short clip we looked at, and you can find her on YouTube, where you just search for Abida Perveen sings Bulle Shah. Is Bulle Shah is a Punjabi Sufi mystic poet, and he's writing about a lot of the themes that we're going to be dealing with today, including which are the battle against the nafs, the battle against the self, the questions of how we get past our own narrow understanding. If you remember early this semester, we had a slide on the narrow interpretation of the fly from Rumi. And that's what we have to ask ourselves: how do we move past that position? And also, the reason why I like Abida Praveen's rendering of Bulle Shah so much is that she's mocking one particular character. And she says, par hazaron kitabon, that you've read 1,000 books. And she's sort of mocking when she says that. But have you ever looked inwards and read the self? And that's the real challenge. Often, when you have academics whose reputation is staked on having a very high pile of books next to whatever I say, um, when when she's asking, but what does it mean? Just the fact that you can cite these scholars, so what? What does that tell me about the quality of your soul, about the quality of your heart? And it is particularly eviscerating, I must say, if you are teaching in uh, it's sort of a context where someone will challenge you and say, that you are half read, or that you don't know the secrets of the self, and you're uh, put off. You're like, but my knowledge is in this one particular area. And that's why I think the questions of epistemology are so important in a course like this, and we keep coming back to them, the questions of how do we know what we know, because there's going to be different kinds of knowledge depending on which fields you're talking about. And so in the case of something like Islam and mysticism, you're going to be dealing with knowledge of the self, which may not be translatable to another person easily. It may require poetry. It may require sitting at the feet of the master for a long time. All right, let's try and get into all of this. So today's class is going to deal with the question of mystical encounters. Let me just quickly see. There's a couple of questions coming up in chat. Do you know what kind of drum that was? A quick question came up. That is a tabla that you were listening to, or a dholk. A tabla, easy enough to find, is one variety, and the tablas, the sound is going to come, and that dodum that you hear, that is a sound that is meant to, in some ways, imitate the heartbeat, the dum dum, of the tabla. And the dholk is the drum with the which is carried usually with a string. And if you've seen any bhangra, you have definitely seen the dholk in action. And it's a two-sided drum. Sometimes played with sticks, and sometimes just with the hand, and occasionally at a wedding, if you've brought me along a spoon on the top, there's a tick tick sound, and that was all I was qualified to do ever. Um, so that at any rate, let's jump into this content for today. So today we are dealing with mystical experience, and I've pulled up a slide that we had from an earlier class from Alexander Knish's book, Sufism, A New Introduction. And he writes here, as for the finding of God, or wujud, divine union, comes after one has raised oneself above ecstasy. The finding of true reality can happen only after one's human nature is completely extinguished, for there is no place for it in the presence of the master of reality. Abu al Hussein al Nuri said about this, quote, "For 20 years I have remained between finding and losing, and that is when I found my Lord. I lost my heart, and when I found my heart, I lost my Lord." let's look at that statement. What do we think of that? How does that? How do we make sense of what Nuri is saying here? Any reads on that? Well, let's take a look here. So the first is this dualism between finding and losing, right? And Finlay, you've written here also to understand in God involves a rejection of self. Yes, the struggle against the nafs. There's a very famous hadith, for example, which deals with this, where the Prophet is discussing the greater and lesser jihad. And for example, at one point he will say the greater jihad is the internal jihad, not the external one, not the kind which is a defensive war against non Muslim others to protect Muslim lands, which would be the defensive kind of jihad, the one that is made most infamous by groups such as ISIS and what have you. But here, this is the inner jihad, the struggle against the self and the desires of the self. And he's saying here, uh, I found my Lord and I lost my heart. And when I found my heart, I lost my Lord. That you cannot have a desire for, let's put it this way. If you empty your mind, let me give you this instruction, all right? If I tell you to empty your mind, can you do it? No, right? Probably pretty hard to do. Now, can you then develop a desire to empty your mind? But isn't that now the desire to empty your mind and no longer emptying your mind? That's kind of the point that he's trying to reach. He's saying that you'll end up desiring the desire to empty your mind rather than actually emptying your mind. That you get lost in the pursuit of something which is only a step to the thing that you're actually trying to get to. This is in Buddhist philosophy, kind of the no mind, no thought. In Japanese Buddhism, you'll encounter this. That if you seek to reach a Zen state or an empty the mind state, then you will be seeking to empty a mind state, not actually emptying your mind. You will obsess over the desire to have your mind emptied, or you will chase the wrong shibboleth, right? You'll hunt the wrong one down, is essentially what they're saying. And so, in the same way here, if the heart is both the vessel and the means by which you can find the Lord, at a certain point, once you have gotten there, you can't then reattach yourself to the self, right? That once you are lost, once you have seen the face of the divine, there's no coming back. You've entered, you've crossed over. And I'm glad Devin has made an appearance because I was going to talk to him a bit today about this veiling and the nature of the veiling of the text. So this language shows up in particular a lot with Sufism about the Quran. We mentioned this last class about the Quran being a veiled text. Now that is something that comes out of Sufi terminology, but in particular, it flows from a discussion that Ghazali has. So, this very important synthesizer of knowledge in Islam, Imam Ghazali separates the sciences into the sciences of the unveiled. And in case you are interested in that and in the subject matter of how we study the process of unveiling the divine secrets, uh, now and is it, you would probably start with Ghazali, and I will post some of that text on our Brightspace in case anyone is interested in how this kind of technical science of unveiling operates. Okay. So again, here on the right, we have this image of the mystic in repose, and he's in locked in meditation. This is from Abdul Qasim al-Kushairi, from and this is the kind of meditative repose he's in. If you look above, we've got the angels in the sky, and often angels in Sufi poetry will also be a representative of reason and rationality in the way that they operate in the poems. And then we've got these dark haired sort of maidens who are offering him gifts. Again, this idea of material attachment, and then you've got the extreme of non attachment on the far right, the kind of mystic who's abandoned all worldly things. And the indicator here in this image that this person is in the elect is this halo around him, right? So this is an example, and this kind of flows naturally from what you would see in our text about descriptions about how to meditate, right? So let's look at what one scholar has to say. So this is from the 14th century, from Kobrawi, and he says, "Here is an exercise to help you banish unwanted thoughts and to focus your mind." And this translation is coming from Karl Ernst's text on Sufism, and is on pages 111 to 112. He says here, sit, part one, sit cross legged, placing the right foot over the left foot, then the hand on the right foot, and the right hand on top of the left hand, facing the direction of Mecca. Hold the image of your master in front of you, because his heart is similarly linked with the heart of his master and is thus connected all the way back to the Prophet. Now, let me interrupt here to say that this is the Sufi silsila, the idea that there's a connection, a genealogical connection from the Prophet to the styles of practice of any particular Sufi community. They often will trace themselves backwards through masters, usually either to Ali or directly to Muhammad, also. All right. So he's saying that you focus, sit cross legged, and then focus on your master. All right. And then the presence of the Almighty. Also, similarly, look upon your earthly body as being dead, to loosen the roots of your thought that are the tool of the soul and the devil. What little effort you can pull out together, gather the internal and external senses in order. The veils of thoughts between the zikr and the heart disappear. Between the dhikr means remembrance here, and the remembrance quickly enters the heart. When you hold in view the image of the master and your earthly form with awe and reverence, draw out the totality of thought, veils from the bottom of the navel, and then you will hear the phrase, there is no God but God, la ilaha illallah, until it is in the right breast and moves up into your neck. Hold it here a while, but make it an actual halt, not verbal. Part two. Then, with the left shoulder and the head and the neck towards the right shoulder, and with the power of La ilaha illallah and the power of the Master's sainthood, throwing out the totality of thoughts and veils together with your dead earthly body behind your breast. Up until one point, you should remember your Master, but after remembering the Master gives way to remembering the truth. Last step. From the right shoulder, knock powerfully with the dhikr, Allah, with perfect awe and reverence. Okay, let's try and get this straight here. So he's saying, sit down. Put your right leg over your left leg in a cross legged fashion. Put your hands together facing Mecca. And then he's going to say, you're going to draw from the left shoulder to the right shoulder. And so he's going to say that you start by looking at the left. You're going to pull down, looking at the navel, moving to the right shoulder, and then exclaiming Allah. So he's saying La ilaha illallah. That's the practice he's sort of asking you to engage in. And so he's saying this form of dhikr, this form of remembrance, is a way of first quieting your thoughts, in addition, bringing you into the presence of the divine, but also for imagining the self as dead, imagining the nafs, the self, as no longer having any control over you. And so these kinds of practices, like this kind of dhikr, is going to be sort of the core of our discussion today. And just for those of us who are going to be following either on YouTube or in the class afterwards, I'm going to have to pause the video when we look at the various forms of zikr from all over the world for copyright issues. However, the citations will be included with the lecture, and so you're welcome to click on those links yourself and be able to check it out. Okay. Finlay, I appreciate your comment here that you're saying that you're thinking about not thinking about it. And that's the most difficult thing to do, right? To think about not thinking. Or if someone says, it's sort of like when someone goes up to someone dealing with depression and says, hey, just stop being sad. And it's like, oh, there we go. That's all I needed. Just a push, a nudge in the right direction. All right. So let's talk a little bit about mystical experience. So at the heart of mystical experience, we have a paradox, right? How do you describe that which cannot be described? Right. That is one of the concerns. That the mystical encounter is the encounter of the divine by us in the here and now. So let's say for the average sort of Muslim, the approach of Islam in terms of your daily life would be do the five prayers, go on Friday to your communal prayers, study the Quran and Islam to the best of your ability, follow the Sharia, the law, to the best of your ability, and you will be guaranteed the garden. Okay. Now, the mystic path, or the path of the awliya, the friends of God that we've discussed in the past weeks as well, is to want to live in conformity with the law, but to also simultaneously desire communion with the divine here and now. And for that end, the example of Prophet Muhammad himself, the idea that Muhammad goes into the presence of the divine and is taken up on his mystical night journey, that is an example of how a human being, maybe, and this in this case, a very special human being, is able to enter the presence of the divine. And in fact, it says even in the accounts that the Sufis recount of Prophet Muhammad's ascendancy into heaven, at the final stage, when Muhammad is about to enter behind, and is about to cross the veil and enter into the presence of the divine, Gabriel stops at that point and says, "I can go no further, because were I to enter into that presence, my wings would be burned off by the love that I would encounter there." And so, what we see is that the prophet, as an example for these mystics, shows how it could be possible to encounter the face of the beloved in this life. That's what Rabia is talking about. That's what Junaid is going to be talking about. That's also what Bizad Bistami is going to be talking about. How do we enter into the presence of the divine? Now, let's take a pause here for a second. If someone that you met in your life today told you that every night when they went to sleep, they communicated with God, they went into the presence of the divine, you'd think they were probably pretty nutty, right? That's not something that we say in general nowadays. That's not something we really talk about. So we have to imagine, first off, a cultural milieu for these figures and the discussion of these experiences in which this is open and commonly discussed. People are having encounters with spirits, with angels, with the divine on a constant basis, and are talking about these experiences and are coming together to relate their experiences as well. And so as a result, there's the environment in which you live in is pregnant with this kind of language. Okay, this kind of language is not alien to these experiences. Whereas in the modern period, if someone is talking about encountering the jinn, experiencing suggestion, our initial assumption would be, for example, that they're experiencing schizophrenia, right? So, an aspect of schizophrenia is that you hear suggestion, you hear whispers, you hear voices. There's a tendency in terms of medical diagnosis to say, well, this person has this illness, it can be treated. If we effectively chemically lobotomize them, they'll be able to live and they won't be hearing the things that they're hearing, right? So, first off, our modern world does not orient us well to hear this kind of story and this kind of encounter. That's one of the hiccups that we have here. Because this epistemology, the epistemology of the personal encounter with God, the way of knowing that is generated through that encounter, is not well. Respected. There was a question by Nawal as to whether I'm saying zikr. Yes. So I'll spell it the two different ways. Uh, these are the two ways that sometimes remembrance is spelled in English or transliterated into English. Okay. So, first step is we don't often talk about this mystical encounter. And if we did, we would end up, if those of you who have read the Dostoevsky's brilliant book, The Brothers Karamazov, may recount this very important moment of the Grand Inquisitor. So, the Grand Inquisitor is a tale that Jesus, returns to earth. And the Grand Inquisitor imprisons him and says, you know, we don't really need you coming back. Things are fine the way that they are. And all that people really want is food. And they can be controlled easily as long as we give them food and a little bit of hope. But we don't need you coming back. And that's the kind of pessimism of the present, is that even the religious organizations and institutions that we have become so this world focused that we have lost the language to talk about the mystical encounter in a meaningful way, right? So that's one thing that we should draw our attention to when we're speaking about this. Now, in terms of let me speak in terms of what I have experienced. So I have not had a mystical encounter, but there's a couple of things which I think come close in my understanding to what the mystics might be talking about. And one of them happened actually when I was visiting Greece in the 1990s. I had gone there with my family, and I was walking around near the Acropolis. And I looked, and there were pillars with Arabic carving in them, which had been done by the Turkish forces that occupied the area before the Greek independence movement. And so I was sitting next to this pillar and I felt something like a wave wash over me, just the way that you do at a beach. That I felt like I was sitting there in repose, and suddenly a great tidal wave washed over me. And there was a feeling of coldness, a feeling of being plunged into something, and I just had to sit down for a moment. And I thought about that a great deal. And the sort of the intellectual treatise that helped me make sense of it actually at the time was Freud, because Freud is going to talk about something he will refer to as the oceanic feeling, the feeling that the world is all deeply interconnected. And I felt something like that at that moment, but it was so fleeting. It was literally like seeing the tail of the dragon, like having a sense that it's there, but not being able to grasp it, not being able to grab onto it. So that's the closest I've come. But in terms of uh, entering mystical states or spaces, some of them, like some of the communities that I have engaged in particular the Rafai and the Naqshbandi and others in places like Toronto, when you do dhikr with them, when you perform zikr with them, it can be quite a bodily experience. And we're going to be showing some examples of that today. And I have to say that when you are, so let's give an example. Let's say you stretch your arms out, you lock yourself in a circle with a bunch of people around you. There's music playing from an oud, just kind of a string instrument that's similar to a lute. There's going to be music playing. It's going to be a drone, so it's going to be repetitive, not too distinct, and you're turning in a circle while just chanting Allah, Allah. And when you're doing that, there's a few things that are going to happen. Firstly, you're going to start to feel very deeply self-conscious about your presence in that space. So that was the place where I first went. I was like, I feel dumb. Have I got enough deodorant on? My arms are up in the air. This is a bit weird. So that was the initial experience of it. As it went on, I began to close my eyes and trust in the people on either side of me, that their trust in their movements and trust the fact that I wasn't going to trip and fall over. And at that point, I closed my eyes. And so here you're in a space where you've got a drone going, a kind of a musical dirge, and then you're chanting Allah, Allah. And not only that, but because there's so many people chanting it, it actually starts to have an impact on the room. And you can feel it bouncing off the walls and coming back to you. And so you begin to feel it impacting your chest each time you walk around in a circle. And in that moment, you begin to feel slightly disconnected from yourself and more part of this community of people circling and chanting. And in that experience, I saw how people could want to connect to zikr and relate to it as a way of encountering or having a mystical encounter. Because the doing those ritual acts together, and it's also sometimes quite bodily, you begin to feel the heat of the room, you begin to feel yourself and the people on either side of you beginning to sweat, and while that's ongoing, you feel a deep connection to each other and the experience that is taking place right then and there. Now, in terms of conservative thought, this would be something quite dangerous, that you're chasing something which is not scripted into the earliest tradition, i.e., it doesn't show up in the Quran and the Hadith. So, where did this kind of supererogatory practice come from? And this is where each of the Sufi orders will make a claim as to where their particular practice, their particular style, their particular approach comes from, and how they claim authenticity in the tradition. All right. And those are going to be different for different communities. But this is just an example of how Sufi zikr, or practices of remembrance, can allow you to experience a kind of negation of the self. I don't know if it was very successful in helping me feel an experience of the divine. I did not feel that that day, but what I did feel is a sense of the extinguishing of the self into something that you were doing communally. Now, it's not strange that psychologists would compare this to chanting by monks in monasteries, or alternatively engaging in long periods of fasting and deprivation where you begin to experience hallucination, or alternatively experiences like a sweat lodge where you feel a deep and powerful connection going on there as well, right? Um, so that is perhaps a shade of what a mystical experience might be, right? Now, let's talk a little bit about how another example of the ways that Muslims can experience an encounter of God is through the reciting of the names. Now, one other thing that's important to keep in mind here is, why do people pray? So one of the reasons that Muslims pray 5 times a day, and or in some formula that reaches five, even if it is three. The reason why Muslims have prayer is because prayer for Muslims is understood to be an opportunity to commune with God. It's an attempt by the language is often quite hierarchical, so it's an attempt by the servant to enter into the house of the Lord. And what that is sometimes enshrined verses of the Quran. For example, when I remember you remember me and I'll remember you. It seems to create almost an ethical relationship between the divine and the human. The idea is that it's through acts of remembrance, and this seems to be also the ways that the Sufis understand the sin of humanity. Humans are forgetful is their sin. It's not so much that they are that they are sinners, that they're cast down to earth for not obeying the word of God, but rather because we exist in a state of constant forgetfulness of the divine, that we are starved in this world, that we have become accustomed to the non-reality. A very a kind of a terrific Sufi film in this case would be something like The Matrix, right? The Matrix is a real illustration of Sufi ideas. It's the idea that you're living in this fake reality which has so convinced you that you continue maneuvering through it as if you're in a dream. Ibn Arabi, of course, will use this at great length, and so it's very easy to have kind of mystical interpretations of this difference between dreaming and waking. And so a lot of film analysis can draw from this as well. Um, but another opportunity is the recitation of the 99 names. And so if you look at a tasbih, prayer beads for Muslims, I'm wondering if mine's in my desk right here. No, no, it has been moved. I think it was taken for show and tell by one of my sons. So if you have a tasbih, it has 99 beads on it. Also, sometimes with additional beads as separators, so you can go in phases of 33. And when you're counting the tasbih, or the Christians would have something similar in the rosary, you would say each of the names of God, the 99 names of God, and flip another bead over on your tasbih. This is another form of remembrance or zikr. And then you'll also see these 99 names showing up on objects such as this talisman container here. This is a Persianate from about the 18th century. And what you're going to see is, if you look very closely, let me get my little pen going here, is here you're going to have different the names of God, each contained here in these small little boxes. In addition, you're going to have Quranic verses here. In particular, you're going to have ones that get used a lot in protection formulas. So the verse of the throne is very famous for that. Frequently, the Surah Fatiha, the first surah of the Quran, and its form is Fatiha is also rendered in the active tense. So when you say the Surah Al-Fatiha, it's also an opening of the self in a certain way, that it opens your heart to what you are doing. And so here is a talisman, and this would have been worn as a form of protection. And you would wear it around your neck, and sometimes with additional prayers in a locket inside. In addition, if you look in West Africa in particular, there was a really extraordinary exhibit a number of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, at the Textile Museum in Toronto, which they had armor from different West African lands, which included the 99 names of God on strips of cotton, which would then be worn below the armor, again as a protective talisman. So this has a operational life in terms of how we engage with the 99 names, that they have a physical form, and also they're very commonly visible in Muslim homes. So for example, people will have the 99 names on a copper plate, or a tapestry displayed on their wall. All right, what are the 99 names? Let's go. Let's give us an example of this. This will be the first time I'm going to pause the recording, uh, that we're going to pause the recording here and watch this video that's going to link off capitalism. Now, let me just give you a little bit of an introduction to what Coke Studio is. So, Coke Studio in Pakistan is one of the ways in which sort of Coca-Cola, an international sort of company, has been working very closely with the cultural ministries and also with local artists to come up with a revitalization of Sufi music combined with Western style instrumentation. And so it has become a real important phenomena in Pakistan and in the diaspora. It has become one of the ways in which Pakistanis and those of us who are in the diaspora, like myself, can watch something simultaneously. So YouTube, for example, will be uploading it at the same time in Pakistan and in Canada, and so we are experiencing this event together. It sort of cuts the distance between here and there, home and away. And so it's interesting as an idea, but what's rather odd about it is Sufism is dedicated in so many ways to being world rejecting and world renouncing. And Coca Cola is kind of the opposite of that. So, Coca Cola, for example, in 2020 was declared the worst polluter on the planet. So, it's kind of odd that you have the local Sufis like even Abida Perveen joining hands with a monstrous company like Coca Cola to produce something quite beautiful. But my hope is in indicating the contradictions in these statements that you will see sometimes that Sufis are often found at the creases of those contradictions, is where you're going to find them hanging out. All right, here's going to be the first pause of the recording, and then we will check out this quick clip of the 99 names being performed, and then we'll have a quick chat about that. The recording now. Great. So any observations on what you saw? Any thoughts? Well, one thing that you would notice if you were to put that side by side with other Coke Studio performances is that one is quite minimally instrumental. So usually with Coke Studio, you're going to have drums and guitars and what have you. In this case, it was done very minimally. There was just a soft kind of a background music, maybe a synth, something playing, and then a drum just playing to announce the coming of each new name. But what you're seeing in that performance is this kind of ecstatic, ecstatic state and a sense of reliance on each of these traits. And what that might mean is that the remembrance of the 99 names is a way of approaching the divine given the signposts. So it is saying the map is not the territory. The divine is not contained in the 99 names, which is this kind of extensive list that has been generated from the Quranic sources, but not just a list, but it's also there. It's like looking at a map and saying, "I've got a map of Nova Scotia, but the map is not itself the territory." So when I go and visit, you know, Truro or what have you, that going there is different than looking at the map. And so, if the 99 names are the map, the encounter of the divine is the actual territory, right? So, this would be the way that there's the relationship between how those of us who are mystically inclined or might desire for this encounter. These are the kinds of activities. Reciting these names and contemplating them is one of the things that you could do to attempt to have an encounter. Um, Elsewhere, you're going to see the mystical names showing up on tombs and mausoleums. Now, this is that of Emperor Jahangir. This is his cenotaph. This is a cenotaph, for those of us not familiar with the term, is today's $5 word. What it means essentially is a shrine that's erected in the place of the body. So the body is not actually interred here, but rather this shrine is interred here as a representation of the body that's not here. And as you can see, it's very sophisticated in design. Jahangir might be familiar to you because when you think of the Taj Mahal, that was one of Jahangir's wives. So when we're thinking about kind of who is this guy in terms of the Indian subcontinent, he's a very important figure. And here you're seeing on his on this kind of cenotaph, here you've got the 99 names inscribed. And there's a couple of other things going on here. One of them is that the way that the inscriptions are done, the styles of calligraphy here sometimes themselves are a serious reflection on the name. And so Muslim calligraphic arts will often be conceived of as part of the mystical branches, that the creation of calligraphy itself is an encounter, is a serious opportunity to seek. Um, and the other bit that you're going to notice is that this is also going to be talking a little bit about the way that architecture is shaped by Sufism. So Jahangir, for example, requires that there not be a dome placed on top of his mausoleum, because when there's no dome there, the dome becomes the sky itself, right? So the sky and the whole world becomes the dome which sits on top of the mausoleum. So in certain ways, when you're thinking about the architecture of Islamic spaces, even if you're going to go to the Taj Mahal and look up, you're going to see that the dome is meant to be imitating the dome of the sky as well, right? So it's the content of the entire universe contained within the dome. So the mystical threads that we're talking about today go throughout all of the traditions. You'll find them in architecture, you'll find them in calligraphy, you'll find them in poetry, and you'll find them in the performance of zikr as well. All right. There's a couple of questions here that have come up. Are there a lot of stances or postures associated with these forms of prayer? So, Robert, this is something that falls a bit to the different Sufi orders. So, in the next week, we're going to be talking about particular orders and particular orders' practices, and we're going to be looking at some of the clips today of different orders performing different practices. So it would depend on which order you belong to. The most famous one, of course, is the Mevlevi, and theirs is the whirling dervishes. So their performance of zikr is done while whirling. And for them, for some, they have applied an almost an atomic theory to it. The idea that an atom is in a state of constant spinning and rotation, and the spinning of the mystic is an imitation of the atom in motion as well. So that's one way of kind of understanding what goes on with the Mevlevi order. And now I see one other question that's here. I've heard Sayyid Nasser say something similar, that the Western world doesn't have much of a relationship with, quote, the sacred, such as the African countries or East. What role does this play in the mystical or Sufi or spiritual experience? Um, well, this. I think Nasser in that statement is maybe overstating it, because so there's a tendency in especially after Orientalism to talk about the East like the mystical East versus the rational West. right? That we live in the realm of reason, and they live in some kind of mystical lost past. And my counter argument to that is that capitalism, especially market capitalism of this latest stage, has been such a dominant impact on the world that it has reordered how we think and approach and engage, even from periods in the course of someone like Nasser's life. In the 80s, aspects of that statement might have been true, but today it's ubiquitous. Every country has to negotiate on some level with the World Bank, has to negotiate on some level to get access to these, retrovirals, or to vaccines, or what have you. So the world, in a certain way, we're encountering the triumph of the kind of capitalist world system, and that often means that mysticism has not gone away. But mysticism has also become capitalized. So now you're going to encounter, for example, if you go to Pakistan, I had I'm going to be very delicate about how I say this. I no, I'm not going to. I had the misfortune of attending a 2-day seminar done by this Sufi master who claimed to come from South Africa. And this guy, I don't like to use the word huckster lightly, but he's felt to me very much like a spiritual huckster. He sort of was inventing new things which you could pay him to teach you, so you could have the access that you needed to solve your problems. So he, for example, provided Sufi business consulting services. So you would hire him kind of like an external HR advisor who would come in, look at the problems in your company, and then give you Sufi and mystical oriented solutions to your problems. If this sounds a bit like bullshit to you, it's because it is. All right. Like I remember sitting in this seminar, just thinking that this was, yeah, a corp evangelist, definitely Finlay. That was exactly what I was dealing with. And so one of the problems of capitalism gone wild in the modern period, and neoliberalism gone wild, is everything sort of restructures itself according to that core relationship, us as consumers and us as mere consumers. So the idea is, why spend all of this time studying how to have a mystic experience, doing zikr, doing all of this? You could just pay a guy there's another huckster out in Malta. You could just pay him, fly to his lodge, hang out with him for 40 days, and he'll fix you, right? And you just follow his routine and he'll fix you. And this is the and oh, it just happens to also cost a lot of money to go and have this experience. So that kind of hucksterism has always existed. And my suggestion would be that it has always existed since the beginning of Islam. But this new era of instant connectability, advertising available through the internet, and also you have a lot of quite wealthy people in places like Pakistan who are feeling a sense of spiritual malaise, and they want to feel a sense of connection. And it's very seductive to have someone who is looking the right part. So he's sort of disheveled and got his eye makeup on, and he's good at spinning and whatnot. And you're like, oh, this guy could really work for me. But it's a trap in a lot of cases, right? My suggestion would be that if you do what Abida Perveen says first, that look inside the self first, figure a little bit of this internal stuff out before you go and outsource your responsibility to someone else for cash, right? Would be my suggestion. But you know, I yeah, you will see a lot of this, especially because. And let me back up just a little bit more. In the 1960s, part of the disillusionment with the church that came in the West was because the church had failed to stop the Holocaust. The church had failed to stop millions dying in war, millions dying from famine. And so there was a real disillusionment with the institution of the church, the structure and the formality of it. And I'm referring to the Roman Catholic Church, but also to a lesser extent, the Protestant churches as well. So there's this real sense of disillusionment in the 1960s. And this is right about the same time when the mysticism of the East is becoming available largely in translation through Orientalist scholars. And so the Beatles are sitting and reading, and they want to go off to Kashmir, and they want to sit on the banks of the lakes. They want to meet their guru. They want to have an encounter with Sai Baba, and so all of this kind of mystical stuff gets also mediated through celebrity culture, like pop stars like the Beatles, and it comes to places like the United States. And at the same time that Buddhism is building the Temple of a Thousand Buddhas, for example, in California, at the same time you're beginning to have Sufi orders starting to pop up. And with the same kind of intent that it's kind of a groovy disconnection from the self. It's talking about mystical states, that you would drop LSD and kind of meditate on Rumi. This kind of stuff is, again, very seductive and very much of its era and of its time. So in the West, there was this really potent encounter with Eastern mysticism. But one of the problems is, and this is particularly true of Rumi, uh, whose name means like the Roman, right? Rumi, his when Rumi is translated in the West, one of the things that they do is that they emphasize the spiritual component and they erase the Islamic component. So if you look in, for example, Omid Safi has a really good article on this in the Atlantic, where he says that the Rumi exists in a rich Islamic milieu. Rumi is himself has memorized the Quran. Rumi has studied Islam and followed the Sharia for all of his life. And then he is writing this poetry. And in this poetry, there is also a high amount of resonance with the Quran. He's borrowing phrases from the Quran, he's turning phrases from the Quran. So it's pregnant with Quranic references, with Islamic milieu. But when Coleman Barks translates him into English, he neatly scrubs out all of the Islam. He makes it just seem like it's any other mystical text, as if Rumi is not also a deeply dedicated Muslim for the entirety of his life. And this is one of the kind of real sadnesses. But we see this when we're in the kind of modern corporatized neoliberal order. We're going to see um, all of these mystical forms from the world being refined into techniques by capitalists, which you can buy, appropriate, and use, right? And if you want to see a really excellent book on this, Jeremy Carrette and King and Carrette are the two scholars, and they wrote a book called Selling Spirituality, which came out in around 2005. And it's really great. And they eviscerate all of these kind of hucksters, whether they be Sufis or yoga masters who are selling you the like special new yoga technique. And if you want to see the kind of what the end result of a lot of these movements is, I would recommend there's a documentary right now on Netflix on Bikram yoga, and you can see kind of what happens when when especially men feel like they've become the head of mystical orders and they've got all these young women hanging around them. It tends to devolve into something that's far from mystical, right, and much more corporal. So that would be my feeling is that when Nasser is saying that we are rational and there's a mysticism over there, that maybe he's speaking to an era which isn't this one, in which my feeling is the overwhelming reality majority is neoliberalism and capitalism and corporatism all over the world, and the rest of us are defining ourselves in relation to that. And so, being a mystic, being a world renouncer, being a rejecter of things, of the world of material objects, is itself an act of defiance because it's non participation in these corrupted systems of capitalism and corporatism and world neoliberalism, for example. All right, bit of a digression. Right, let's now get to the question of um, what zikr is going to look like in many different cultures. I would like us we're going to watch a bunch of clips of videos, but I noticed that we are right up on 2 o'clock according to my clock. So let's take our 10-minute pause here. I'm going to set up the timer for our 10-minute pause. And then when we return, for those of you who are watching this remotely or after the fact, you are not going to be watching the videos that we are going to watch. So I will show these videos. They will all be linked on the slides and through the library's website or through YouTube, but we will not be watching them as part of this module. But watch them on your own, and then we'll be back together for the discussion. All right. I'm going to pause the recording, put up a 10-minute timer, and I'll see you then. Um, the cultures that we're going to be looking at are, we're going to look at a zikr from Chechnya. We're going to look at a Qadriya zikr from Cape Town in South Africa. We will look at a different one by the same order in Sudan. Then we're going to see the University Chorus of Taiwan, the National University of Taiwan, performing a zikr in a chorus, which was something I had never really seen before. So that was new for me too. Then there's a different order of the Naqshbandi Muslims. And again, if you're a little bit confused as to who the Qadriya or the Naqshbandis or the Mehlevis or what have you, we will discuss the different Sufi orders in the next class, and we'll get a bit of an understanding of who these different groups are as well. We're also going to look at a group in Dagestan and a group in Missouri. Now, the things I would like you to pay particular attention to when we're checking out these videos is what exactly is the group doing? Is it very physical? Is it very, are they moving a lot? If they are moving, how are they moving? That's one thing I'd like you to pay attention to. The other thing is, for those of you who can recognize the words, in a lot of cases, they're going to be saying La ilaha illallah, which is there is no God but God. Or alternatively, they might be just saying Allah over and over in different ways. So these are the kinds, that's the oral, the kind of bit that I'd like you to hear. And then the last thing I'd like you to pay attention to is what can you tell me about the kinds of people engaged in this? Do they look wealthy? Do they look like they are weirdos? Do they look like, do they look like outsiders, insiders? These are the kinds of questions that I'd be interested in. So let's try to keep those comments in order as we're going through the videos. So I will pause the recording here, and we will check out these various recordings, whomever. So in these various forms of zikr that we took a look at, what you're going to see is, number one, is that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of consistency across cultures in terms of the form, the physical form that the zikr is going to take. It may take a bodily form in which there's a lot of movement. It may take just more of a meditative form. The voices may be in unison together. Chanting in almost a drone. In some cases, there's going to be lead voices who are going to be reciting aspects from prayer manuals or duas or poetry or what have you. And so there's a beautiful inconsistency here. And in the argument of scholars like Shahab Ahmed, perhaps the inconsistency is a good thing, that it shows you how in each of these different cultures the traditions of Sufism became domesticated and localized in their different forms. And if you're going to look at a historian like Marshall Hodgson, he is going to make the explicit argument that Islam spreads through practices like these, because these are the kinds of practices that have a higher appeal. Like, for example, when you are in an era of low literacy, when there's a low likelihood that you are able to encounter the Quran on your own merit and be able to read it and engage with it, these are developments of the kind of post-industrial printing age, right? Is that that's when we get a Quran in every home. When a Quran has to be written by hand, and it can be a very long process to inscribe it. You may not have as ready and as constant access to the text. And so encountering the Quran becomes then something which you outsource to others. So a Quran reciter would be doing the recitation for you at your mosque or your local community or your shrine, and you would attend to listen to the Quran. And even if it's not available to you in your local vernacular, then you're there just to engage with the audio qualities of it. And then practices like this would give you an opportunity to bodily engage, to chase that kind of encounter, that mystical encounter through these practices. And that's what my sense is, how these zikrs tend to operate. They reaffirm your sense of community because you come together, and you see each other. You also have to have a certain amount of trust in each other, especially if you're in environments where these things are being punished. So, for example, in Afghanistan, the Taliban may want to break up a zikr that's taking place as well. Um, yeah, with the people in Missouri, I want to kind of I sort of set them up a little bit as a fall guy, because it it looks silly. But my suggestion would be that a snapshot of America looks silly, right? Like a bunch of people from a bunch of different culture, different clothing styles, different ways of encountering the world, all showing up together. Even here, if you just look at the kind of faces that we have in our chat here, we're a wide variety, right? A wide, beautiful multiplicity of people. And so, from that perspective, why shouldn't the encounters of the divine code itself to the local area? So, whereas the group in Missouri is a little bit unnerving for someone like me to look at, that's because of the context that I come from. But if you sincerely are coming up in Missouri and you join this community and you're having a meaningful experience of this encounter with the divine, and you decide to bring your friends and family with you and gather around with people who illuminate your life and perform this together, then it sounds like a very meaningful act. It looks kind of beautiful. And why shouldn't it look so disheveled? In fact, there's a famous story once about Rumi, in which a sultan says he doesn't like Rumi's followers because they look like vagabonds and ugly and they misbehave. And in fact, the ruler says the worst thing that you could possibly say about someone is he says they lack proper adab, that they lack proper etiquette, that they cannot be in good company. And so Rumi comes in front of this sultan and he says to him, of course, these people are like this because that's why I am their master. That's why they connect to me. That's why they relate to me. Because if they had perfect manners, if they had perfect behavior, if they were the right kind of people, they wouldn't need a path like this. And his indication is almost that sometimes this kind of disheveled, unruly nature is part of the narrative as well. In fact, he'll make this very beautiful claim, um, where he'll say, "Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of living, it doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you have broken your vow 1,000 times. Come yet again, come, come." And in the words of Abda Parveen, when you were seeing earlier, she kept saying, Ayakar, Ayakar, keep coming, keep coming. And what she's trying to illustrate is she's trying to say that, and what Rumi is saying here is that sinfulness, being a bad Muslim, being a bad believer, drinking, taking drugs, fornicating, all of these things that you did, don't let it discourage you from trying to cultivate that connection. That this is the philosophy reaching out to even the losers, right? That even if you have not performed your prayer properly, if you have not followed the right order, the right rules, the right God up until now, if you want to find this meaning, ours is a caravan of love, that you can join it and you can be a part of it, and you will be forgiven in its spaces. And actually, for Marshall Hodgson, this is what he's thinking about. He's saying that the Islam practiced in the form of these zikrs at communal level in communities in India, Pakistan, etc., is how everyday illiterate people would gain an encounter of something powerful and moving with their co religionists. This would be the experience coming together, engaging in these practices, feeling unified, standing also as a political objection to if you had a Hindu prince, for example, coming together in the zikr publicly would be a statement against, to say we are here, our presence is here. So these are the kinds of other things that is going on in zikr, and that's why even though the Missouri one was set up to look a bit silly next to some of the others, I would argue that it is a sincere practice, but it's a sincere practice of those people. And it maybe looks like that because those people are from all over. There are a multiplicity coming together to try and make something beautiful. And maybe it looks a bit jumbled to us as outsiders, but I bet you for the people in that experience, they were having something authentic taking place for them. Um, just a couple of last points I wanted to kind of indicate. I don't want us to go too much longer, but I did want to share one thing from Lao Tzu, and Lao Tzu is, I think, one of the great Sufi masters, which maybe sounds odd because he's pre-Islamic by a long shot. Um, but this is the same kind of poetry about the divine that Rumi is going to be writing about as well. And we are going to be encountering Rumi in about two classes. And then our next class, we're dealing with the Sufi orders themselves. And the class after that, we're dealing with poetics. But I wanted us to look at what Lao Tzu is said here, and how the Sufis would argue that what Lao Tzu is saying is consistent with the way that they read the Quran and mysticism. So here he says, the Tao, by the way, here, the word translated as Tao is a word very similar to the word Sharia, in the sense that Tao means path or way. Sharia also means path or way. And in fact, in pre Islamic times, the Sharia could also have been the route to water, specifically the path that camels would take to get to water. And here Lao Tzu is saying, uh, ways may be spoken of as Tao, but they are not the eternal Tao. Names may be cited as names, but they are not the eternal name. Nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. Named is the mother of all things. Thus, through eternal non being, one observes its mystery. Through eternal being, one observes its manifestations. The two have the same origin, but differ in names. Both may be called profound. Profound and still more profound is the gateway to all the mysteries. So let's see what often interpreters say that what Lao Tzu is engaging in here is he's showing the two extremes. He's showing opposites. He's saying, how can you be and not be? But for Sufi mystics, this is the nature of the divine, because on the one hand, you've got the 99 names which are telling you about God, but at the same time, they don't contain God, they don't limit God, that they're not understood to be that because God is mercy, that God cannot do things which are not necessarily mercy or don't appear like mercy to us. That God has no limit as such, and to imply a limit is to actually engage in the lower levels of blasphemic declarations, is to argue that God is limited. So, for example, when he's saying here, through eternal uh, sorry, through eternal being, one observes its manifestations. For a cosmology like Ibn Arabi's, this would make a lot of sense. One would say that while you are in a state of being, i.e., connected to this corporeal material reality, all you see around you are manifestations that in the dream state, right? That all you would see is other aspects of the dream. But if you want to seek the really real, you've got to get behind the mystery. You've got to get to the thing that is unnamed. The even though you have the names for it, it exists as eternally unnamed. Um, and I'm not just BSing. There's an entire book on this. Toshiko Isutsu, a very important Japanese scholar of the Quran in the Japanese language, wrote this brilliant book called Sufism and Taoism, in which he reads Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi together with Ibn Arabi. And what you'll see is this particular approach that Sufis understand their wisdom, the mysticism that flows through the tradition, to have flown through all of the prophets from time immemorial, so from Adam onwards, that the same sort of legend, the same kind of the prophets are telling us about the encounter with the divine. Prophets are telling us about the secrets and the secrets of the heart. And to access them, you can even study scholars from other traditions. And so, what we see in particular in places like Baghdad and in Persia is the translation of yogic manuals, for example, manuals on the performance of yoga, and not strip mall yoga, but like yoga, i.e., in the exercise that orders the universe kind of yoga. And so, that's where we're also going to see that Sufism, it feels a familiarity and with a kinship with other religious traditions. And often in journeys of travel, like Ibn Arabi himself goes on, he will encounter other religions and other traditions seeking out the same sort of mystical thread flowing through them. And in the case of conservatives, that seems to fall outside the ambit of what should rightly be construed as Islam. And so it's a source of ready criticism. And for Sufis, the belief is that this reaffirms the truth of Sufism because it has flowed for time immemorial through all the traditions. All right. I've had a lot to say today. Any questions or comments at this stage before we wrap up for the day? No? Well, I very highly recommend during your break week next week, and just for those of you tuning in, we are not meeting next week. Although my office hours are still available if you want to chat with me, just because COVID has made it so I don't go anywhere. And so the extent of my journeying is up and down the stairs. And so if you need to get in touch with me, please feel free to reach out. The one thing I would suggest, though, if you have access to Spotify or YouTube, check out. I would love for you to check out one or two other examples of zikr on your own, ones that I haven't shown you, and just get a sense of what you think about them. And I'll try and create a discussion page on Brightspace. And if you want to throw an example in, that's one way we can make sure that for those of us who are students and need participation points, that'd be a good one to catch up some points on. So check out a zikr practice, listen to a zikr, and my suggestion would be do it in non-capitalist time. So set aside a chunk for yourself where you're allowed to slip into the resonance of the words that you're hearing, right? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Enjoy your break next week and the sort of release of breath that it allows. In Sufi terms, it would be the Hu week that I hope you enjoy. And I'll see you on the flip side in a couple. And we'll be getting right back into it with our discussion of Sufi orders, and I look forward to that. Thank you, and have a good day.